Imagine for a moment. You are walking through the narrow stone corridors of an ancient cathedral, where the air is soaked with the scent of incense and candle wax, where every step echoes under the vaults, and the shadows from the columns lie on the floor in fanciful patterns. And then, in this solemn silence, among the marble statues of the popes, your gaze suddenly stops on a single bust of a woman's face, crowned with a papal tiara. The inscription reads, Giovanni VIII, a woman from England. What is this? A stonemason's error? Or the trace of one of the most mysterious stories of the Middle Ages? Greetings, my dear listeners. Tonight, we'll be traveling through the mists of time to a place where history is intertwined with legend so closely that even centuries later, it's impossible to know where one ends and the other begins. Write in the comments what city you are from and what time it is. Let's feel our voices merge into a single chorus stretching across continents and time zones. Close your eyes and travel with me to the 9th century, when Europe was just beginning to wake up from the long sleep of the Dark Ages. Imagine a world where knowledge was rarer than gold, where the ability to read Latin elevated a man above the crowd, and where the walls of monasteries held almost all the written treasures of civilization. In this world, where a woman could not even dream of higher education, where her destiny was confined to the walls of a house or a monastery cell, an unusual story was born. Somewhere in the land we now call Germany, in the city of Mainz, or perhaps Ingelheim, a baby girl was born in the home of an English missionary. Historians have never agreed on the exact place of her birth. But imagine this house, wooden walls soaked with the smell of tar and smoke from the hearth, where in the long winter evenings, crackling logs casting a golden glow on the pages of manuscripts. The girl's father was a man of learning, one of those rare clergymen who brought the light of Christianity to pagan lands, and with it, Latin, Greek, the basics of medicine and philosophy. And in this house, filled with the rustle of parchment pages and the quiet muttering of prayers, the little girl from her earliest years showed something unusual. While her peers were playing with rag dolls or helping their mothers with chores, she was sneaking into her father's books. Imagine her, a tiny figure in a long dress of coarse cloth, carefully turning the heavy pages, running her finger over the unfamiliar letters, trying to unravel the mysteries hidden in those black scribbles on the yellow parchment. The father at first smiled at his daughter's inquisitiveness, but when the girl began to ask questions about the declensions of Latin words, when she began to distinguish Greek letters and understand the meaning of church texts, his smile was replaced by surprise, and then by anxiety. For he, more than anyone else, realized what such a craving for knowledge could lead to in a world where women had no place among scholarly husbands. But there was no stopping her. She absorbed knowledge as dry earth absorbs the first spring rain. Latin came easily to her. Greek revealed its secrets. The basics of medicine seemed clear and fascinating. She studied the works of the Church Fathers, read the lives of the saints, immersed herself in philosophical treatises, and with each page she read, one thought grew in her mind: the idea that the world of knowledge was infinitely wider than the walls that society had erected around women. Imagine those long evenings with the winter wind blowing outside the window and the fire crackling in the hearth. The family would gather for dinner, and inevitably, the conversation would turn to the future of the daughter. The mother, a practical and pious woman, dreamed that the girl would marry a worthy man or go to a convent, devoting herself to prayer and needlework. The father, seeing his daughter's extraordinary abilities, was torn between pride and anxiety. He realized that such intelligence was a gift from God. But at the same time, he knew that this gift could be a curse in a world that was not ready to accept a learned woman. And the girl sat with her eyes down and listened to these conversations about her fate, feeling her heart grow. Not rebellion, not anger, but a quiet but unyielding determination. She saw how her brothers were free to go to monastic schools, how they could dream of a career in the church or at court, how all the roads of knowledge were open to them. And she realized that if she wanted to follow the same road, she would have to become someone else. The idea did not come to her at once. At first, it was only a vague thought, a shadow of a possibility that flashed through her mind during another reading of the lives of the saints. She had read of Saint Marina, who lived in a convent under a man's name, of Saint Eugenia, who disguised herself as a monk to escape her marriage. These stories, meant to edify and glorify Christian piety, became something more to her. They became a guiding star. Gradually, the plan began to take shape. A monastery was where she could continue her education, but not a convent with its limited range of books and activities, but a men's monastery where the best libraries were kept, where scholarly disputations were held, where she could study not only the Holy Scriptures, but also medicine, philosophy, rhetoric. And for this, she had to become something other than what she was born to be. The decision ripened quietly, like fruit ripening on a tree. One of those days, when the spring sun had first really warmed the air and the apple trees were in full bloom, she went to see her father. He was sitting in his study, bent over a manuscript, and in the candlelight, his gray hair seemed silver. She stood beside him and said quietly, "Father, I want to devote my life to the service of God." He raised his eyes, and in them she saw understanding. He knew what she meant, though she did not tell the whole truth. The preparation took months. Not only did she have to prepare male clothes, a rough brown robe, leather sandals, a simple wooden cross, but she had to change herself from the inside out. She was learning to walk in a manly way, with wide steps, without ceding, as girls were taught to do. She learnt to speak lower, to control her intonation, her gestures, her facial expressions. She learnt men's manners, ways of behaving in the company of other men. But the hardest part was changing her mindset. She had to learn not just to look like a man, but to think like a man who knew from birth that the world belonged to him, that knowledge was his legal right, that he could go wherever he wanted and become whoever he wanted. This required not only an outward masquerade, but also a deep inner transformation. The day came when everything was ready. It was early morning. The fog was light. The birds were just beginning their first songs, and the air was as fresh and cool as spring water. She stood in front of a mirror, a rarity in those days, looking at her reflection. The brown robe concealed the female form, the hood obscuring her features, making them appear rounder, more masculine. In the mirror, a young monk looked back at her, ready to embark on a journey for knowledge. The farewell to the family was quiet and painful. The mother cried, not fully understanding what was happening, but feeling that she was losing her daughter forever. Her father hugged her tightly, and she felt his hands shaking. "Be careful," he whispered in her ear. And there was everything in those words. A blessing, a warning, a prayer. The journey to the monastery at Fulda took several days. She walked along dusty roads, past fields where farmers were beginning their spring work, past villages where dogs barked at the stranger, past forests where owls hooted and unknown creatures rustled in the twilight. With each step, she grew more and more accustomed to her new role, more and more confident in her male form. When the walls of Fulda, one of the most famous centers of learning in Europe at that time, appeared before her, her heart beat so hard that she was afraid that the thumping might not betray her excitement. Fulda was not just a monastery. It was an academy where thousands of manuscripts were kept, where the most learned men of the time lived and worked, where one could study not only theology, but also the 7 liberal arts: grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. The abbot of the monastery received the new novice favorably. A young man from Mainz, the son of a missionary, well versed in Latin and Greek, thirsty for knowledge, and ready for the rigors of monastic life. What more was needed to add to the brethren? He could not have known that the woman standing before him was a woman who had committed this incredible deception for one single purpose: the right to study. So her new life began. Every morning, when the bell called the brethren to morning prayer, she got up with the others, pulled her hood down, and went to church. The cold stone slabs beneath her feet, the smell of incense, the monotonous chanting of psalms, all these became part of her daily routine. But real life began after the prayers, when the brothers went about their business. In the scriptorium, where manuscripts were copied and illuminated. In the library, where the rarest texts could be studied. In the classrooms, where scholarly debates were held. Her abilities became apparent very soon. Her teachers were amazed at the speed with which the new novice grasped complex theological concepts, the ease with which she translated from Greek, the depth of her understanding of medical treatises. She soon became one of the most promising students in the monastery, the one entrusted with the most valuable manuscripts and the most difficult assignments. But it was not easy to live in constant fear of exposure. Every day brought new challenges. She had to be careful in the common baths, to avoid situations that might give away her true nature, to constantly control her voice, her gestures, her demeanor. She learnt the art of being inconspicuous and at the same time noticeable. Inconspicuous as a woman, but noticeable as a scholar. The years in Fulda flew by like a day. She learnt all that the monastery could give her, read all the books in its library, learnt by heart the basic theological texts, mastered the art of disputation and rhetoric. But the more she learnt, the stronger her thirst for knowledge became. She heard of other centers of learning: Paris with its schools, Italy with its ancient traditions, Byzantium with its treasures of ancient wisdom, and Athens especially beckoned her. Ancient Athens, the cradle of philosophy, where Plato and Aristotle had once taught, where manuscripts unknown in the West could still be found, where Byzantine scholars kept traditions that went back to the very beginnings of European civilization. Of course, little remained of the great Athens of the classical age, but even what remained seemed to her like a promised land. The decision to leave Fulda for Athens was not easy for her. Here she found not only knowledge, but also something like a home, like a family. The brethren had grown accustomed to the quiet, scholarly young monk, and many considered him their friend. But the call of knowledge was stronger than attachment. She did not set out alone. She found a companion among the brethren, a young monk as passionate about learning as she was. Some said later that there was not only friendship between them, but also something more, the kind of forbidden affection that can arise between people living in a closed world where human warmth is especially valued. Whether it was true or not, we'll never know. But as the two of them set off on their long journey, leaving the familiar walls of Fulda behind them, there must have been something else beating in her heart, a feeling she could neither name nor explain, but which made it not just a journey of knowledge, but a journey to a new life. The road to Athens lay across Europe, across the Alps, across Italian lands, across seas and islands. It was a journey not only in space, but also in time. From the austere northern world, where Frankish kings and Germanic traditions ruled, to the Byzantine world, where echoes of ancient Rome and Greece still lived, where the marble and gold of the temples kept the memory of the times when the gods still walked among men. Athens greeted them with the noise of the harbor docks, the shouts of traders, and the smell of the sea mixed with the aromas of spices and olive oil. Imagine this ancient city in the 9th century, no longer the majestic cradle of philosophy that it was in the time of Pericles, but still a place where a living tradition of scholarship thrived between the dilapidated columns and marble rubble of ancient temples. Byzantine scholars, like bees, gathered here the honey of ancient wisdom, copying and preserving manuscripts that in the West were considered long lost. When she first stepped onto the stones of the Athenian agora, where Socrates had once taught, her heart sank with awe. The sun was setting, coloring the Parthenon's marble a golden pink, and the air had that special smell of a southern city, a mixture of dust, sun-warmed stone, sea salt, and blooming oleanders. Here, every stone breathed history. Every path could remember the footsteps of the great philosophers of antiquity. Her companion, a young monk from Fulda, walked beside her, and she could feel his excitement, which was similar to her own. They were like two pilgrims arriving at a shrine, only their shrine was not the relics of saints, but living sources of knowledge. The monastic schools and scriptoriums of Athens held the Greek manuscripts of Aristotle, the dialogues of Plato unknown in the West, the medical treatises of Galen, the mathematical works of Euclid, all the treasures of human thought that she longed to study. Finding shelter was not as difficult as they had feared. Byzantine monasteries were renowned for their hospitality to Westerners, especially those who came with a sincere desire to learn. The abbot of one of the monasteries, a gray-haired man with shrewd eyes and ink-stained hands, a sure sign of a man who had devoted his life to books, received them graciously. He spoke a marvelous mixture of Greek and Latin, and his speech had echoes of that living tradition, which linked Byzantium with the ancient world. "Welcome to the city of wisdom," he said, and there was no empty rhetoric in his words. Athens was indeed still a city of wisdom, albeit on a much more modest scale than in ancient times. It was still home to people for whom arguing about the nature of the soul or the essence of beauty was not an abstract exercise, but a living, important endeavor. The first weeks were spent learning the local customs and exploring the libraries. She quickly realized that knowledge was treated differently here than in the northern monasteries. Whereas in Fulda, scholarship had been a means to a better understanding of sacred scripture, here it was valued in its own right, as a gift that the Creator had placed in the human mind. Here one could study Plato, not only for the sake of better understanding St. Augustine, but also for the sake of Plato himself, for the beauty of his thought and the elegance of his arguments. Her abilities were even more vividly displayed here than in Fulda. Greek, which few in the West knew, was the living language of the church and scholarship here, and she spoke it as fluently as if she had been born in Constantinople. Her commentaries on ancient texts impressed teachers with their depth of understanding, and her ability to link Western and Eastern traditions made her a valuable participant in scholarly debates. Soon the young Western monk became the talk of the scholarly circles of the whole city. He was invited to give lectures, consulted on difficult theological questions. His interpretations of ancient philosophers were written down and transcribed. His fame grew like the fame of an actor on stage. Each performance brought new admirers and made his name more and more famous. But this triumph had its bitter flavor. Every day spent among the admiring audience, every praise, every recognition of her talent reminded her that it was all built on deception. She was not who she claimed to be, and the higher her fame climbed, the worse her eventual fall became. Her companion from Fulda saw her inner struggle. A special relationship developed between them. Not just friendship, but something deeper and more complex. They spent long evenings in conversation, strolling the ancient streets of Athens under the starry skies seen by Pericles and Phidias. They talked about philosophy, about theology, about the fate of the world. But underneath these scholarly conversations, there was another current, the current of human warmth, of mutual understanding, of the intimacy that is born between people who share a common mystery. Was there love between them as ordinary people understand it? We shall never know. But there was something that made them not just study companions, but companions in a deeper sense. People who together carried the weight of an unusual destiny, together took risks, together learnt the joy of intellectual discovery. The years in Athens flowed like honey. She studied not only theology, but also medicine, an art that had never been completely forgotten in Byzantium, unlike in the West, where much ancient knowledge had been lost. She studied the works of Hippocrates and Galen, learning to understand the structure of the human body, the nature of diseases, and the methods of treatment. This knowledge would come in handy later, when she would become one of the most educated people of her time. But gradually, Athens became crowded for her. She studied everything the local libraries could provide, took part in all the important disputes, and earned the recognition of all the learned men of the city. Her eager mind demanded new horizons, new challenges. And so her eyes turned to Rome, the eternal city, the center of the Christian world, the place where the destiny of the church was decided, and where the talented could rise to the most dizzying heights. The decision to go to Rome did not come immediately. Rome was not just another city. It was the capital of the papacy, the heart of ecclesiastical power, a place where every step was under close scrutiny, where any mistake could cost not only his career, but his life. To go there was to play the most dangerous game of all, with everything at stake. But the temptation was too strong. Rome was home to the richest library in Christendom. It was the home of the most influential theologians. It was where decisions were made that affected the destinies of millions of people. For a person of her ambition and ability, Rome was a natural destination, just as it is natural for a ship to seek the most important harbor. Saying goodbye to Athens was bitter. The city that had given her so much had become dear to her as home. But even more bitter was the farewell to her companion from Fulda. He had decided to remain in Athens, having found his vocation in the study and copying of ancient manuscripts. Their last meeting took place on the same hill where the Apostle Paul had once preached, under the same starry sky that had witnessed their first conversations. What did they say to each other that last night? What words of farewell did they say? Did they confess the feelings that they had hidden for so long, even from themselves? History keeps silent about it, but one can imagine how they stood among the ancient stones, feeling that they were parting forever, that their paths would never cross again. And each of them would carry in his heart the memory of those years as the brightest time of his life. The way to Rome lay across seas and mountains, through Italian lands where every city held the memory of a great past. She did not travel alone. By then, she had companions, other clerics who also sought the center of Christendom. Her reputation as a scholar and theologian preceded her, and letters of recommendation from Athenian teachers opened many doors before her. When at last the view of Rome opened up before her, with its hills crowned with churches and palaces, and when she saw the dome of St. Peter's Cathedral rising above the ancient ruins, her heart shrank with awe and fear. Here was the true capital of the world, not the political world, which had long since moved to Constantinople and Aachen, but the spiritual world, the world where the word of the Pope could raise armies and overthrow kings. Rome, in the 9th century, was a city of contrasts. Among the grand basilicas and papal palaces were the huts of the poor. Among the marble columns of ancient temples converted into churches, goats and pigs grazed. It was a city where past and present existed side by side, where scholarly men gathered among the ruins of the Forum to argue about the subtleties of theology, where in the shadow of the Colosseum, manuscripts were copied that would preserve knowledge for future generations. Her arrival in Rome did not go unnoticed. The fame of the Athenian teacher, a man equally fluent in Latin and Greek, an expert in both Western and Eastern theological tradition, reached Rome before she did. The papal curia always needed educated people who could correspond with the Patriarch of Constantinople in Greek, interpret Byzantine theological texts, and participate in complex dogmatic disputes. Very soon, she was offered a position in the papal chancery. At first, a modest position as a scribe and translator, but it was the first step on the ladder of the church hierarchy. The papal chancery was located in the Lateran Palace, and to work there meant to be at the very heart of church power, to see how the decisions that determine the fate of the Christian world are made. Her workplace was in a large hall where dozens of clerics sat at long tables, bent over parchments. Here, papal bulls were drafted. Letters from Eastern patriarchs were translated, and theological treatises were rewritten. The air was saturated with the smell of ink and parchment, occasionally disturbed by the rustle of pages and the quiet muttering of people reading aloud complex texts. Her abilities were immediately apparent here. Her translations from Greek were characterized not only by accuracy, but also by literary elegance. Her copies of manuscripts were flawless, and her commentaries on complex theological texts impressed her colleagues with their depth of understanding. She soon became one of the most valuable members of the clerical staff, the person to whom the most difficult and delicate tasks were referred. But clerical work was only the beginning. In Rome, as elsewhere, talent and knowledge opened the way to higher positions. She was noticed not only by her immediate superiors, but also by the Pope himself, a man who was educated and valued scholarship. Leo IV was one of those popes who realized that the Church needed not only saints, but also intelligent people who could defend Christian doctrine against heresy and find answers to the challenges of the time. Her promotion was rapid. First, she became secretary of the papal curia, a position that involved not only technical work with documents, but also participation in important decisions. Then came her appointment as a notary, a rank that gave her the right to attend closed sessions of the Cardinal's College and to know the deepest secrets of church politics. Each promotion was both a triumph and a challenge. A triumph because it recognized her exceptional abilities. A test because it put her in a more and more prominent position, made her the object of more and more scrutiny. In the small world of the papal curia, where everyone knew everyone else, where every gesture and every word could be discussed, it became increasingly difficult to hide her true nature. But she was doing fine. Years of disguise had taught her to be an actress of the highest caliber. She knew how to hold her own among cardinals, how to participate in their conversations, how to express her opinions in a way that sounded authoritative, but not defiant. She learnt all the subtleties of church politics, understood who is friends with whom, who fears whom, who aspires to what. And gradually, she became not just a participant in this game, but one of its key players. Her advice was valued. Her opinion was taken into account when important decisions were made, and her influence grew day by day. She was no longer the timid young monk who had once left her parents' home to change into a man's cassock. She became an experienced church politician, a person who was known and respected throughout the Christian world. But the higher she climbed, the more acute the loneliness became. She couldn't share her secrets with anyone, couldn't allow herself real intimacy with other people. Every day was a balancing act on the edge of a precipice. Every conversation required constant self-control. And in this loneliness, amidst the splendor of the papal court, amidst the splendor of the ceremonies and the luxury of the cardinals' palaces, her heart grew stony and her soul grew stale. Only one thing remained constant: her passion for knowledge. In her spare time, she still studied manuscripts, participated in theological debates, and wrote commentaries on the Church Fathers. It was this passion, this unquenchable thirst for understanding, that made her who she became. And it was this passion that eventually led her to the very top of the church hierarchy. When Pope Leo IV died on the 17th of July in the year 855, the complex negotiations and intrigues that always accompany the election of a new pontiff began in Rome. The cardinals gathered in the Lateran Palace to decide who would succeed the deceased pope. The names of the contenders were many, but one name was increasingly heard among them, that of the learned cleric, who, within a few years, had gained a reputation as one of the most learned and wise men in the papal curia. The election lasted several days. There were heated arguments, alliances were made and broken. Each faction defended its candidate. But gradually, it became clear that the compromise figure capable of uniting the different factions could be this man. Not too young to appear inexperienced, but not too old to be bound up in old feuds. Scholarly enough to raise the authority of the church, but not too radical to frighten the conservatives. And then, one August day, in the year 855, the white smoke over the Vatican announced to the world that a new pope had been elected. His name was announced in the square in front of St. Peter's Basilica, like a thunderclap, and at the same time as something natural and inevitable. John VIII, whom some called John Anglicus, John of England, thus the woman who began her journey as the nameless daughter of an English missionary, became Christ's vicar on earth, the successor of St. Peter, the Pope. Her coronation took place in St. Peter's Cathedral in the midst of a huge crowd. The tiara, the triple crown of papal dignity, was placed on her head, and the keys to the kingdom of heaven were placed in her hands. And no one present had any idea that they were witnessing one of the most incredible deceptions in the history of mankind. Imagine a morning in the papal palace of those distant days. The first rays of sunlight pour through the tall windows, coloring the marble floors with golden hues, and the air is filled with the scent of incense, which seems to have soaked the very walls over centuries of prayer and worship. In the silence of the corridors, you can hear only the soft footsteps of servants carrying jugs of water for morning ablutions, and the distant singing of birds in the papal gardens, where ancient fountains gush among cypresses and oleanders. In his private quarters, the new pontiff begins another day of a reign that has already lasted more than 2 years. 2 years and 5 months, a term that will go down in history as the time of one of the most enigmatic pontificates. Every morning, she wakes up in a luxurious bed under a canopy of expensive fabrics. Every morning, she looks in the mirror at the face that the world knows as the face of Pope John. And every morning, she experiences anew the surprise at the improbability of her position. Her reign was a time of wisdom and learning. She was not a warrior pope like some of her predecessors, who led armies into battle against the Saracens or the Lombards. Nor was she a pope builder, erecting magnificent basilicas to the glory of God. Her strength lay elsewhere, in her profound knowledge of the Holy Scriptures, in her ability to interpret the most complex theological issues, in her ability to find wise solutions to the most intricate ecclesiastical disputes. Under her leadership, the papal library was enriched with many new manuscripts. She personally supervised the translation of Greek texts into Latin, promoted the exchange of knowledge between East and West, and patronized scholars and scribes. The scriptoriums of Roman churches were busy from morning to night, transcribing the lives of saints, theological treatises, and ancient texts that the Church found useful for Christian education. Her letters to the bishops of France and Germany were remarkable for their depth of theological thought and elegance of Latin style. The Byzantine Patriarch Photius, a tireless opponent of papal authority, had to recognize the erudition of the Roman pontiff, though he continued to argue with him on dogmatic questions. In those days, when theological disputes were fought with the fervor of political battles, the ability to find precise words and convincing arguments was valued no less than military prowess. But papal rule in the 9th century meant more than just spiritual authority. The Pope was also a secular sovereign, ruler of vast lands in central Italy, a judge in worldly disputes, a diplomat negotiating with kings and emperors. And in this secular role, she also showed remarkable ability. Her decisions were characterized by fairness, her diplomacy by wisdom, her administration by efficiency. Imagine an ordinary day in her life. In the morning, a private mass in the papal chapel, where only a small circle of those close to her participates in the service. Then, audiences with the cardinals, discussing the current affairs of the church, making decisions on controversial issues. In the afternoon, meetings with envoys of various sovereigns, study of dispatches from distant dioceses, work with documents. And in the evening, when the day's duties were completed, there were those rare hours of solitude when one could become oneself again, immerse oneself in reading one's favorite books, and ponder the eternal questions of existence. But even in these quiet evening hours, loneliness did not leave her. She was surrounded by people, cardinals, secretaries, servants, but she knew no real intimacy with anyone. Her secrecy was the wall that separated her from the world. She could be gracious to her subjects, wise in her advice, just in her decisions. But she could not be just a person among people, and into this carefully constructed life, into this world of strict self-discipline and constant self-control came love. Not the lofty spiritual affection she had felt for her companion in Athens, but an earthly, carnal passion that turned her world upside down. His name was, but history has not preserved his name. We only know that he was a chaplain, one of those young priests who served at the papal court, officiating in the small churches, assisting in administrative matters, part of the vast machine that ran the Christian world. He was probably younger than she was, handsome with that subtle, spiritualized beauty, which is especially attractive in a man who has devoted himself to the service of God. When did their rapprochement begin? Was it a momentary flash of passion, or a slow, gradual realization that there was more than an official relationship between them? Maybe it began with long evening conversations about theology, when the two of them would stay in the library after the other clerics had gone to their cells. Maybe it began with the stares that grew longer and longer, with the touching of hands as they handed over documents that lasted little more than necessary. In the atmosphere of the papal court, where everyone lived according to strict rules, where personal life was sacrificed to the service of the church, such relationships were not just forbidden, they were unthinkable. All the more so for a pope who was supposed to be the embodiment of Christian virtues, a living example of chastity and abstinence. But the heart does not know the laws that men make. In the long Roman evenings, when the city was falling asleep to the sound of the bells ringing for vespers, when the last candles were going out in the papal chambers, things happened between them that should not have happened. They met in secret, in secluded corners of the vast palace, talking about things that had nothing to do with ecclesiastical matters, touching each other in ways that people bound by a vow of celibacy should not. For her, these meetings were a breath of air in the stifling atmosphere of constant pretense. Here, next to him, she could at least partly be herself. Not the Pope, not the man she had pretended to be all her life, but simply a woman who loved and was loved. In his arms, she forgot the weight of the papal tiara, the complexity of church politics, the fear of exposure that haunted her days and nights. Months passed in this double life. By day, she was a pontiff, making important decisions, leading the church on the path she thought was right. By night, she was a woman learning the joys and agonies of earthly love. But this position could not last forever. Secrets tend to come out, especially in a place like the papal court, where dozens of eyes are watching everyone, where every gesture can become the subject of gossip. The first sign of impending disaster was a change in her well-being. Morning weakness, dizziness, nausea, symptoms which at first she attributed to the fatigue of papal duties. After all, the weight of responsibility that rested on the shoulders of the Roman pontiff could break any man. Church administration, diplomatic correspondence, theological disputes, administrative affairs, all this required a tremendous amount of energy. But gradually, it became clear that it wasn't a matter of overwork. Her body was changing, taking on new shapes that were increasingly difficult to conceal beneath the wide papal robes. What for any other woman would have been a source of joy, the expectation of a child, for her became a source of terror. Pregnancy meant not only the end of her career, but very likely the end of her life. How did she survive these months, when the realization of the inevitability of catastrophe grew day by day? Did she try to find a way to get rid of the child? Such ways existed in those days, although the church strongly condemned them. Or was her maternal instinct stronger than her fear, and she decided to carry the pregnancy to term despite the risks? Her chaplain, on learning of her condition, must have had feelings no less complicated than her own. The joy of parenthood was mixed with the horror of the consequences. For if their liaison was discovered, he would not only lose his dignity, but perhaps his death. In those harsh times, adultery by a priest, especially with the Pope himself, was considered a crime deserving the most severe punishment. They tried to keep the secret as long as possible. The papal robes, wide, layered, helped conceal changes in her figure. She made fewer public appearances, delegating many duties to the cardinals, citing the need to concentrate on important theological works. But in the world of the papal court, where every little thing became the subject of discussion, such changes in the pontiff's behavior could not go unnoticed. They whispered of the Pope's illness, of his strange habits, of his avoidance of those ceremonies which required him to wear tight-fitting liturgical garments. They whispered, but they did not yet understand the real reason for the change. After all, who would have thought that the Roman pontiff was a woman, and a pregnant woman at that? But you can't cheat nature. The due date was approaching, and her body was preparing for labor, regardless of her wishes and fears. She could feel the baby's movements more and more often, and realized more and more acutely that disaster was inevitable. She could only hope that the birth would take place in the privacy of the papal chambers, where it would be possible to conceal what had happened. But fate had decreed otherwise. On one April day in the year 857, or 858, as sources differ on the dates, a solemn procession was to take place in Rome. Such processions were an integral part of papal ceremonialism. The pontiff, surrounded by cardinals and the clergy, would march solemnly from St. Peter's Basilica to the Lateran Basilica, or back, blessing the assembled crowds of the faithful. On that day, the sky over Rome was clear, and the air was warm and pleasant. The streets through which the procession was to pass were decorated with flowers and carpets, and the windows of the houses were open wide with brightly colored cloths hanging from them. The whole city was preparing for the feast, for that joyous occasion when one could see the Pope up close, receive his blessing, and feel oneself a part of the great Christian family. She realized that she could not avoid taking part in the procession. Too many eyes were watching her. Too many questions would be raised by her absence. She could only hope that everything would go well, that she would be able to endure a few hours of the ceremony. And then, somehow, the procession began in St. Peter's Basilica with a solemn mass. She stood at the altar in full papal attire, white alba, dalmatic, ornate, decorated with gold and precious stones, with the papal mitre on her head. Around her were cardinals in scarlet robes, bishops, abbots, the whole color of the Roman clergy. The chanting of the choir ascended to the vaults of the cathedral. Incense smoked in thick clouds. Candles burned with thousands of lights. But beneath the splendor, beneath the solemnity of the moment, something was happening in her body that should not be happening here and now. The contractions began during the Mass. At first, weak, almost imperceptible, then stronger and more frequent. She clenched her teeth, trying not to let the pain show, continued to worship. But with each passing minute, she realized that disaster was imminent. As the Mass ended and the procession moved through the streets of Rome, the pain became almost unbearable. The papal porters carried the canopy over her head. The cardinals walked to the sides. The people shouted greetings and asked for blessings. She walked, leaning on her staff. Each step she took with great difficulty, the sweat covering her forehead. But she could not stop. The road from St. Peter's Basilica to the Lateran Basilica ran through narrow medieval streets. One of them, the one that would later be called Vicus Papissa, Via Papessa, was particularly narrow. The high walls of the houses were almost closing overhead, creating the feeling of a corridor. It was here, in this stone corridor, amidst the cheering shouts of the crowd, that something happened that changed the course of history forever. She felt like she couldn't walk anymore. Her legs shook, her eyes went black, and the contractions became so strong that it was impossible to hide them. She stopped, grabbed the wall of the house, and immediately the cardinals walking beside her realized that something was wrong. What happened next can only be surmised in general terms. Witnesses to those events, if there were any, left no detailed records. But legend tells us that right there, in a narrow Roman street, amidst a crowd of pilgrims and townspeople, a child was born before the eyes of astonished cardinals and bishops. The secret she had kept all her life was revealed in the most dramatic way. What was going on in the souls of the people who witnessed the unbelievable? How did the cardinals feel when they suddenly realized that the man they thought was the Holy Father was a woman? How did the crowd feel when they saw one of the basic foundations of their world crumble? At first, there was probably just bewilderment. People couldn't believe their eyes, couldn't understand what was happening. Dad, the woman, childbirth. These concepts didn't fit into their minds, contradicted everything they believed in, everything their lives were based on. But bewilderment was quickly replaced by other feelings. Some were horrified that they had witnessed such sacrilege. Some felt anger at the deceiver who had led the church astray for so many years. Some felt pity for the woman who had risked everything for the right to be who she wanted to be. And some might even admire her courage and ability. There are several versions of what happened to her next. According to one of them, the saddest, she died right there on the stone pavement, unable to survive the difficult labor and the shock of exposure. Her heart, which for so many years had borne the weight of incredible lies, could not bear the moment when the lies collapsed. Another version, more brutal, tells how she was lynched by an angry mob. The people, feeling cheated, wanted revenge. They tied her to the tail of a horse and dragged her through the streets of the city. A horrible death for someone who had just hours before been Christ's vicar on earth. But there is a third version, a more merciful one. According to it, she survived. The shocked cardinals, realizing the scale of the scandal, which could shake the foundations of the church, secretly hid her in a remote monastery. There she spent the rest of her days in penance and prayer. And her son, when he grew up, became Bishop of Ostia. This version seems the most humane, but hardly the most plausible in those harsh times. What became of her chaplain? And here, history remains silent. Perhaps he shared her fate. Perhaps he managed to hide in the crowd and flee Rome. Perhaps the church authorities decided to cover up the scandal and let him disappear, just so as not to draw additional attention to what happened. And the baby? What happened to the little creature whose birth was a disaster? Did he survive? Did he know of his unusual origins? Did he really become a bishop, as one legend claims? Or was his trace lost in the chaos of those dramatic days? We have no answers to all these questions. History, as it often happens, has preserved only the contours of the events, leaving the details to the arbitrariness of legends and speculation. But one thing is certain. What happened on that April day in a narrow Roman street shook contemporaries so strongly that the echoes of this shock have reached our days. Immediately after the tragedy, the church authorities naturally tried to keep the scandal quiet. The official chronicles of the time say nothing about Pope John. The official chronicles of the time say nothing about Pope Joan, but refer to Benedict III as her successor, as if those 2 years and 5 months when the church was ruled by a woman did not exist at all. But people's memory proved to be more tenacious than official history. People remembered what they saw, told their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren about it. The history grew in details, changed, was supplemented, but did not disappear. And a few centuries later, when the first daredevils dared to write down this story, it had already become a legend about a woman who dared to climb the highest rung of the church hierarchy. Maybe in this transformation of history into legend lies its main value. After all, legends live longer than facts, penetrate deeper into human hearts, and speak of things more important than a simple series of events. The legend of Pope Joan speaks of the courage of a woman who was not afraid to challenge a world where she had no place, about the power of the human quest for knowledge that can overcome any obstacle, that talents and abilities know no gender, that intelligence and wisdom can blossom in anyone, whether male or female, and let church historians debate whether Pope Joan was a real historical person or a figment of medieval imagination. Let archaeologists search the archives for documents that might shed light on this mystery. What is important is not so much whether she really existed, but rather that people believed in the possibility of her existence, that the story of a female pope seemed to them not only possible, but necessary. In this necessity lies perhaps the main mystery of Pope Joan. The world needed such a story, an example of a woman who could achieve the impossible. It does not matter whether she actually lived in the 9th century or was born in the imagination of medieval storytellers. What is important is that it lives in our minds, reminding us that human dreams and aspirations are stronger than any prohibitions and restrictions. Centuries later, historians would argue about its existence. Some will point to the absence of contemporary sources, to the continuity of papal succession between Leo IV and Benedict III, to the silence of the Byzantine patriarch Photius, who would surely have used such dirt in his disputes with Rome. Others will look for traces of her rule in the numbering of popes, in the ancient customs of checking the sex of the newly elected pontiff, in the toponyms of Roman streets. But while scholars argue in libraries and archives, the story of Pope Joan continues to live on in art and literature. Giovanni Boccaccio will include it in his book on famous women. Alexander Pushkin will sketch a play about her, describing her main trait as passion for knowledge. Cinematographers will make films, artists will create paintings, and tarot cards will feature the Papus Arcana, a woman in a nun's cassock and papal crown, with a cross in one hand and a book in the other. And every time we hear this story, we hear more than just an account of distant medieval events. We hear the eternal song of the human spirit, which cannot accept limitations, which strives for knowledge and freedom in spite of obstacles. We hear the voice of all those who have ever dreamed of becoming more than the circumstances of birth allow. Perhaps this is the true value of the legend of Pope John. Not whether it was a historical reality, but that it became a symbol that human ability knows no boundaries of gender or class, that talent can flourish in all conditions, that the dream of equality and justice lives in human hearts for centuries, passed from generation to generation, as a lamp is passed from hand to hand in the dark. And now, as our journey back in time draws to a close, as we have traced this amazing journey from the home of an English missionary to the papal throne, from the mystery of childhood to the tragedy of exposure, we need only close our eyes and imagine silence. The same silence of the night with which we began our story. The silence in which all the stories of the world live. Those that have been, those that could have been, and those that are still waiting to be told. Good night, my dear listeners. May your dreams be full of amazing stories, and may tomorrow bring new discoveries and new wonders. See you next time, when we will again go on a journey through the labyrinths of time, where every turn may reveal to us something incredible, something beautiful, something eternal.